The Nintendo Entertainment System. Some people call it the NES or the NES. Some people call it the old Nintendo. And some people call it junk. To me, it's a treasure trove for memories and shared experiences. Millions of young adults played Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda, or Mega Man growing up, so it's not surprising that its nephew, the recently released NES Classic Edition, has sold out everywhere. I have a lot of love for the NES, but it isn't without its shortcomings. In this video, I'll walk you through my journey of overcoming two of its biggest shortcomings: picture quality and game connectivity. The biggest problem with the NES, and the hardest one to solve, is lack of high-quality video options. You only have two analog video options that come standard on the NES. One is the RF switch. The RF switch uses radio frequency signals to encode the audio and video all through a single cable, and it plugs into the white RCA plug on the back of the NES. It's an amazing technological achievement, but from a quality standpoint, it's about as bad as you can get. The video and audio quality are both poor. The other option is one you've probably seen a lot of over the years: composite video over RCA cables. The video goes to the yellow cable, and the left and right audio are split out to the white and red lines. RCA cables plug into the right side of the NES, and since the NES only offers mono sound, only one audio cable is used. Since the audio is separated from the video, the resulting video is cleaner. But even though composite video is better than RF video, it's still pretty terrible. Take a look at this overworld video from Super Mario Bros. 3. See how blurry the text is? Now look at the grass around the moat. It's not dancing with the music like the plants are. In fact, it shouldn't be moving at all. It's shifting because when you cram that much analog video information through a single cable, it's impossible to separate it out into a clean signal. And that's it on the NES. That's all you get. But that wasn't the case for later systems. These are multi-out cables. The Super Nintendo, N64, and GameCube all came equipped with a 12-pin multi-out port that you could plug these cables into. It's called a multi-out port because its 12 pins allow it to carry a variety of video formats along with stereo sound. There's a pin for composite video, but also pins for even better video signals like S-video or RGB video. And to understand the difference between these video types, we're going to go down a brief rabbit trail. Composite video is named what it is because it's a composite of chrominance, or color information, and luminance, or brightness information, along with sync, which tells your screen when to display the lines and frames of the picture. It's hard to cleanly separate all of these things on the receiving end, which is why composite video has image quality issues. S-video, or separate video, improves upon composite by splitting the chrominance and luminance information into two separate lines. It sends the sync over the luminance line. The TV then reassembles those elements to create the picture. Here's an example photo from Wikipedia showing luminance, chrominance, and the combined picture. There's an even better option than S-video though, and it's called RGB. RGB stands for red, green, blue. These are the primary colors, and using different combinations of these three, you can create any color. In fact, that's precisely how the majority of phone, TV, and computer monitors work. Your screen has thousands of pixels, and each pixel is made up of 3 subpixels, one for red, one for green, and one for blue. Take a look at this shot from one of Super Mario Bros. 2's opening screens. Now look at the word story at the top of the screen. Here's a photo of my TV displaying the word. Now if we darken it a bit and zoom in, you can actually see the red, green, and blue subpixels making up the white letters of the word story. If we go higher up on the image where it's displaying the color red, you can see that only red pixels are being used. This is why RGB is great. It keeps everything clean and gives the TV everything it needs by giving red, green, blue, and sync their own lines so they don't interfere with one another. There's a lot more we could get into about SCINC, but I'll leave it there for now. That crazy connector you see there is called a SCART connector, and it's a common connector capable of carrying RGB. It's prevalent in Europe, but not so common in the US, so it requires special equipment to use it here. So why am I telling you all of this about video signals and multi-out connectors? Because I want to make my NES capable of producing those kinds of better video. And here are the parts I'm going to install. What you see here is the NES RGB Kit designed by a brilliant Australian electrical engineer named Tim Worthington. His kit uses the original PPU, or Picture Processing Unit, from the NES to produce S-video and RGB video. To its right is a socket and some pins we'll use later, and below it are some circuit boards for video connectors and a voltage regulator. The NES has its own voltage regulator already, but we'll be adding this second one in so that this new circuit board doesn't overstress the existing one. To the right, you can see a handful of doodads provided with the kit. There's a 3-position switch that lets you switch between various color palettes, a 3.5mm audio jack to carry the audio, a proprietary connector to carry RGB, and a connector for S-video. When the kit's fully installed, it looks like this. Whoever did this installation did a beautiful job, but I'm a minimalist and I didn't want 3 holes in the back of my NES when I could, in theory, have 1. Tim's rationale for splitting up the video and audio is a good one, born from a great deal of engineering design experience. It prevents the lines from interfering with one another and causing artifacts, particularly in the audio. But with cables that are properly shielded and properly grounded, we should be able to use a single connector. That's where the multi-out connector we talked about earlier comes in. I did some research and discovered that Buffalo Wing and Helder of assemblergames.com had actually designed and 3D printed some multi-out connectors. Here's a closer look at their design. Their multi-out connector simplifies things a lot, because I won't be needing the 3 connectors provided with the kit, and I won't be needing the boards for those connectors either. Just one multi-out port that carries everything. In the upper right hand corner is an oddly named product called Blinking Light Win. It was originally funded by a Kickstarter campaign and solves the other major problem at the NES, which is loose connectors. The 72-pin connector of the original NES would get loose and stop making good contact with the games. When a game didn't make a good connection, it wouldn't load, and the system's power light would blink, thus the name it was given. This product has a better design than the original connector and solves the loose connection problem that would cause the power light to blink. It even goes a step further and bypasses the game cartridge's lockout chip, meaning it could play cartridges from other regions on my NES. This can be installed in 5 minutes with only a Phillips head screwdriver, so I recommend picking one up if you're having problems with your system. The stuff in the bottom right hand of the screen is used for updating the NES RGB's color profiles, but I'll talk about that more at the end of the video. For now, let's take a closer look at the NES RGB board. There's a lot going on here, but every big problem is just a series of smaller ones, so let's break down what we're seeing. On the top right are pins for audio output, audio input from the NES CPU, S-video chrominance, S-video luminance, composite video created from RGB, blue, green, red, and sync, the original composite video created by the PPU, a couple of ground lines, and a 5-volt line. In the lower right hand corner is where we're going to mount the PPU. The pads on the lower left will be used to switch between different color palettes, and the pins on the top left can be used to update the color palettes if desired. So let's crack open the NES. Here's the NES's motherboard, and here is the PPU. We have to use a soldering iron and various other tools to desolder or disconnect this from the motherboard without damaging it. It has 40 legs on it, and every single one has to be freed before it can be removed from the board. Desoldering this chip is not easy, and it's why I'd never recommend this mod to someone without a lot of soldering experience and a lot of patience. Here's a picture with half of the legs freed up. See how the light is coming through the holes? I clamped it vertically and sucked the solder out of one side while applying heat to the other side. See this huge circuit trace here? This makes the legs particularly difficult to free up in this area because that trace draws heat away from the legs. It makes them harder to get hot, therefore the solder is harder to remove. After a lot of time and effort, I finally got it out of there, albeit with a battle scar from a pair of pliers. You can see where it used to reside on the motherboard here. The next step is to solder in the socket provided with the kit, so I went ahead and did that here. Using a socket raises up the NES RGB board and also makes it removable. Here's a side view showing the socket and some capacitors that are too high to let the board sit flat. See what I mean? All you have to do is bend them down to make room and voila, the NES RGB board can sit flat. There's another problem to address though. Remember those strips of pins provided with the kit? Those plug into the socket, but they also interfere with the PPU's ability to lie flat on the NES RGB board. The set of pins that will sit underneath the PPU need to be trimmed down. So I flush cut them with some wire cutters, then filed them a touch lower with a metal file, and now the PPU can sit flat. Next, the strips of pins need to be soldered to the NES RGB board. So I did that. Then the PPU needs to be soldered to the NES RGB board as well. So I did that. The bottom right leg of the PPU broke off at one point, so I gave it lots of solder to ensure it got a good connection. If you're counting, that's 120 solder points so far. While I had the motherboard out of the system, I polished up the RCA jacks. And now it's time to start stripping wire. If you do this mod, you'll thank yourself for using a wire stripper like the one shown here. It'll save you a ton of time and it does a perfect job every time. Okay, so all of the wires are soldered and things are looking a little crazier now. I used 22 gauge wire for everything except the power and ground lines going to the voltage regulators, where I used 18 gauge wire. I wouldn't go bigger than 22 gauge for everything else because the holes on the multi-out connector are fairly small. On the left, you can see where the audio is being taken from pins 1 and 2 of the NES's CPU, and you can also see where I have 2 wires going to the output audio connector. Even though the NES only produces mono sound, I put a wire for both the left and right stereo lines of the multi-out connector so I wouldn't have sound coming out of only one side. On the bottom, you can see where the color palette switch is all wired up, and on the upper right, you can see where the new voltage regulator is connected to the unregulated input and ground. If you're planning on doing this mod yourself, you might notice that I'm putting the voltage regulator in a different place than Tim Worthington shows on his website, and that the video and audio lines are going to the left while the power lines go to the right. This is because the power lines can sometimes cause interference with analog video signals, and I wanted the voltage regulator and power lines to be as far away from the video as possible. The risk of interference is probably negligible, but I didn't want to take any chances. One other thing not shown here is the J5 jumper. If your system is an NTSC system like mine, you have to solder this jumper for the board to work properly. I did, but you can't see it under the wires. Okay, now I need to mount the multi-out connector and palette switch to the console's plastic housing. I'll be using a larger bit to get a couple of starter holes going for the multi-out connector, and we'll finish it off with files. The 3/16 bit shown here is the perfect size for the palette switch hole. I did a lot of measuring and planning and marked out a conservative guide in blue tape. After a ton of filing, double checking, and more filing, I was finished, and the multi-out connector fits flawlessly. With the multi-out connector, you're normally supposed to drill a hole on each side of the connector to mount it with screws. But again, I'm a minimalist, and I really felt the screws would detract from the appearance of the perfectly flush connector. I could use hot glue, but hot glue is a mess. It's ugly and it isn't very strong. I could use epoxy, but epoxy on relatively smooth surfaces doesn't always hold up very well, and it's a hassle to repair if it gives up. So I did some more thinking, some more measuring, some more manual labor, and created these unassuming little support struts. Here's a top-down view of the multi-out connector. The support struts slide right onto the existing pegs of the NES without any glue. They're easily removable, and they stay in place because I left little nubs on the ends that pop into the screw holes of the multi-out connector. I gave the connector a good push from the left and right sides to test things out, and the struts work perfectly. The connector doesn't budge. Next is the palette switch. The color palette switch can be mounted discreetly on the bottom of the case. Just take a 3/16 bit, drill in the most obvious place, and you're all set. Now it's time to start reassembling this thing. The last modification I need to make is to cut a hole in the metal shielding that goes on the bottom of the NES, so there's room for the color palette switch. It was the only part of the mod I hadn't planned for, which is why it turned out pretty uggo, but it works. You can see the installed shield and the palette switch here. It's tight. So tight it almost hit the 72-pin connector, but the switch barely clears it. I ended up putting some electrical tape on top of it just in case. The last step is to replace the metal shielding on top. You might also notice the new voltage regulator on the right. If you mount it here, you'll have to file a crescent out of the top of it to make room for one of the plastic pins. And that's it! A beautiful, minimalistic mod. The multi-out port looks like it was always meant to be there, and the palette switch is barely noticeable. Let's fire it up! Oh, that's not good. This is actual video footage of the first time I turned it on. I was concerned, but I wasn't too discouraged by this because the worst case scenario isn't corrupted video, it's no video. If you really look at the video, you'll notice that it's sharp with some artifacts over the sprites. My mind returned to that damaged leg of the PPU. I thought maybe something went wrong when I formed that bridge out of solder. So I went back, desoldered it, added some wire to the leg, and resoldered it. I checked every other solder point and everything looked perfect, so I fired it up again and it still looked like this. It seemed pretty odd to me that the video would be super sharp but have buggy artifacts over the sprites. I was worried that I might have damaged the PPU from the heat of the soldering iron or from when I grabbed it with the pliers, but that's when I remembered. This isn't the first time I'd seen something like this. Many years ago, I replaced the worn-out 72-pin connector of another NES with a new one, and it didn't make good contact with the pins on the motherboard. When I took it off and reseated it on the motherboard, it fixed everything. So I took the blinking light wind's 72-pin connector off, cleaned the motherboard pins with isopropyl alcohol, reconnected the 72-pin connector, and fired it up. That did the trick. My installation was fine all along. And would you look at that glorious video? Look how sharp the text is. Look at the grass around the moat. It's not dancing anymore. Here's the video from before again for reference. And here are some before and afters from a handful of other games. I'm thrilled with the whole thing, and I can't believe how good it all looks. There's only one thing left I'd like to do on this, and that's a project for a later time. You might have noticed that the colors of the new video didn't quite match the colors of the old video when you were watching the comparisons. Remember that gear I showed you at the beginning of the video? That little hardware interface and that USB blaster is what I'm going to use to update the NES RGB's color palettes so they match the original NES's colors. It was created by Steve Kuloff of HD Retrovision, so special thanks to him for his great work on this and the Super Nintendo component cables, and special thanks to Firebrand X for his continued efforts in creating the most accurate NES color profiles possible, along with his great work on the XRGB-mini custom profiles. As of this video, Firebrand X is currently working with Tim Worthington on some new, more accurate color profiles, so I'm going to wait to update the color palettes until then. Thanks again to Tim Worthington for creating such an incredible product, to Helder and Buffalo Wing for creating the multi-out connector, to Retro Console Accessories for making the best SCART cables around, to Reddit's game collecting community and Assembler Games for keeping classic gaming alive, to my dear friends for all the laughs we've had as we game, to my dad for lending me his wisdom and his tools, and to my mom for always striving to make her kids happy, even if it means hunting down every single Mega Man game when we didn't have much money to our name. Love you guys. Hope you enjoyed the video, and best of luck to anyone else trying to perform this mod. I hope what I've shown you here helps your installation go smoothly, or gives you some creative ideas of your own. Now, I'm going to go play some Mega Man.